Hi, welcome to Unit 6. In this unit, we continue to focus on CSS. We start to actually make some things that legitimately look good, that aren't just a bunch of random colors, but things that are color coordinated, things that are laid out nicely, and those are really at the end of this unit. But before we get there, we have three main objectives that we want to talk about. The first is that I want to show you some of the important font and text-related properties in CSS. Things like font size, font weight, how do we actually set the font, and so we'll talk about that in the first few videos. And then I'll show you how we can include some good-looking external fonts using a tool called Google Fonts. And then our final main objective for this unit is to talk about something called the box model, which is a really important concept that's intrinsic to how CSS works. And then once we do those three things, we're going to work on three different projects. The first project is the simplest and the least exciting, I'd say. We're going to make a simple tic-tac-toe board. It's not going to work. There's no logic behind it. We're just going to make a simple grid with some lines and center some things. And that's really to hammer home the way that the box model works. And then things get a little more exciting. We're going to make an image portfolio site. So an image gallery, all black and white images, include a font, make things look pretty nice. We'll make it responsive. And I think you'll enjoy that one. And then finally, we'll make an HTML and CSS blog. And the idea on this final exercise is that it's an exercise. Rather than a project where you just follow what I do, you'll actually be asked to recreate it yourself first and see how you can do using the concepts that we learned in this unit and the previous unit. And then there'll be a solution video that's really comprehensive. We go through the entire process from scratch. So we definitely have a jam-packed unit. Let's go ahead and get started. So this video is going to focus on fonts in CSS. And obviously having fonts and picking fonts for a web page is really, really important. But we're also going to cover a lot of other properties that are related to fonts and to text. And those are font family, font size, font weight, line height, text align, and text decoration. So in this video, we're going to stop and cover all of those. And the first thing we're going to do is get our simple text up that we're going to style. So I have a simple fonts.html file, and I'm going to go ahead and add in some HTML. So I'm just going to do an H1 so that we can see a header and style that, and then some paragraphs. So I'm just going to call this fonts demo page. And then the next thing, rather than just typing some random words or some gibberish like this, which actually doesn't really reflect what the English language looks like on a page, I'm going to use a lorem ipsum generator. So for those of you who don't know, lorem ipsum generators are used to generate a bunch of random text that is English words. It doesn't mean anything at all, but it at least looks like real words. So it is placeholder text. So I have a kind of funny article open of 10 of the best or the most hilarious lorem ipsum generators for web designers. And I'm just going to go with this first one, bacon ipsum. So I'm going to generate a few paragraphs here. Click give me bacon, and you can see it just gives me some text, but this is real text that actually looks like a potential, something you would have on a website. It doesn't look like just gibberish like this. So it's a better representation of a font. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. I'm going to make 2 paragraphs out of this. All right, and we'll leave it at that for now. And we'll come back and add a little bit later, but let's just open this up and see what we have. Okay, so here's the site that we're going to be styling. And the first thing that we want to do is talk about how do we actually just assign a font to anything. And before we can even do that, we have to talk about what fonts we even have available to us in the browser. So there's no easy answer as to which fonts a computer has available in the browser. And that's because they're different on every machine. And I have this site open here, CSS Font Stack, that actually shows, depending on if you're on a Mac or a Windows, what the percentage of those machines are that have a given font. And so these are just kind of the standard web fonts that we'll see a lot of the time. So if we look at one like Helvetica, you can see that every Mac has Helvetica, but very few Windows have Helvetica installed. And so these are the system fonts that come on a machine. So these are not the only fonts that you can use, but these are some that are safer bets. So if you wanted one that you knew for sure would work on every machine, you would pick like Arial Black or Arial. Obviously these fonts though are pretty limited. So we're going to see how we actually include custom fonts later in this video, but for now, let's just pick one of these. So let's go with Arial Sure, Arial. So to use that, we're going to assign that to our paragraphs here. So I'm going to go into my CSS, which I have linked here, styles.css, and the property is called font family. So I'm going to select paragraphs, and I'm going to say font family is Arial, just like that. And if I refresh, you'll see I now have Arial font here. One quick note, I can also put quotes around this, which is totally valid. Sometimes you'll have to do this if you have a font that has a number at the beginning. Not that this is a real font, but if that was, I would have to put quotes around it because this is not a valid CSS line. Okay, so I can give it Arial like that, and you can see we get Arial. So there are other fonts we can play around with. Let's try Georgia. So let's give our H1 Georgia. Just like that. Refresh, and you can see it changes font. So don't despair if you're a designer. We're going to see how to use a lot more fonts and how to include custom ones. But for now, we're just going to focus on the built-in system default fonts, which are a little bit limited. And even then, there's no guarantee. As you can see, there's not any that 100% of machines have. So the next property I want to talk about is font size. So font size does what it sounds like. It controls how big the font is or how small the font is of a given element. So we can select something, and let's do it to our H1, and let's make our H1 a lot bigger. So we do font size, and there are different units that we can use. And the first one is called pixels or px, and we've seen it a little bit before with border. So we're going to just give it something huge like 200 px. And if we go back to the browser, you can see we get this gigantic font, 200 pixels. What we can do, just in case if you want to play around with font sizes, you're not sure how big you want this to be, we can inspect it. And then we can go over here and we can click on this and we can change this number. So we can change it to 100 or 60 or 85 or whatever we want, and we can play around in the browser and just see it, the change reflected immediately. So that's a really nice feature when you're playing around with font sizes. So as I mentioned though, this is not the only way of picking a font size. It's not the only unit. There's another popular unit called EMs. And EM is basically a relative font size. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the font size MDN page and go to the EM section. And I'm going to read from here for just a moment. The size of an EM value is dynamic. An EM is equal to the size of the font that applies to the parent of the element in question. So what that really means is, I'm going to show you a quick example. If I put, let's go inside of here under strip stake, I'm going to put a span element. And all that a span does, this is probably our first time seeing them, is it's just a way to group text together without actually making a difference visually. So it's just a way to kind of make an element around the word strip stake. But if I refresh, nothing changes at all. Well, aside from the font size, but nothing changes down here where I have the span. So it's a way to highlight or to single out some line and then do something to it. And we're just going to make it a lot bigger. So we use an EM, or we use the EM units, and if we wanted to make this double the size of the font of this paragraph, we just go into here, select span, and then we just say font size 2.0 EM. And so that is going to be double the font size of the enclosing element, or the parent element, which is this paragraph. So you'll see that here. If I refresh, this span is double the font size of this, but we didn't actually explicitly tell it how many pixels to make it. It just knew how big this was, and then it doubled it. So this is dynamic, which is why a lot of people like it, is that if for some reason I needed to change the font size of this would automatically change. So let me show you another example. Let's increase the font size of paragraphs. font size, and let's make them 40 pixels. And you can see that this still stays double. So then the one question about EM that comes up a lot is, what is the initial value of EM? What is the top level? Because we can't just keep inheriting from a parent and a parent. There has to be some source of truth. There has to be like the very top level element that actually has a font size. And that actually changes depending on the browser, which is a little bit frustrating. But according to MDN, it's usually about 16 pixels. So that's no guarantee, but it's usually around 16 pixels. So what most people will do is set a font size on the body at the very beginning. So something like this. Body, font size, and let's do something really small to start, like 10 pixels. And then let's change our H1 so that it's 5 times larger than the body. So that's going to look like 5.0 EM. And then we want our paragraph to be twice as large as the body, so 2.0 EM. And then lastly, we want our span to be twice as large as the paragraph, so that's also 2.0 because remember, it's nested inside. So let's do some text outside of a paragraph, just like that. And you'll see it's pretty small. And then we made this 5 times larger than this. We made this twice as large, and then this is twice as large as the paragraph. In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off, talking about 4 more font and text related properties. The first of which is called font weight. And so the weight of a font refers to how bold or lightweight the text is. Basically, how thick the actual font or how thick the lines are. So I'll give you an example here. We'll select all paragraphs and we'll say font weight bold. And so this is one of the options. We can say font weight is bold. And then I'm going to go to this file and refresh, and you'll see that the paragraph becomes bolded. Likewise, I can go back and I can change it back to normal, or I could just delete all of this. But if I change it back to normal, it now goes back to the normal font size. One thing I'll point out is that certain fonts will let you use a numeric value as well, and that ranges from 100 to 800. And it's not any number between 100 and 800, it's every 100. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 500, 600, 700, and 800. So that depends on the font itself, if you have that. So it looks something like this. That would be the lightest, and this would be pretty heavy, and this would be the heaviest. So we'll see how to use that actually in the next lesson when we talk about Google Fonts. So I'll change this back to bold for now. So line height does exactly what it sounds like it does. It controls the height of a given line. So if we go back to our browser here, we take a look at these paragraphs. Notice the line spacing here, how much space there is between this line and the next. And if you've ever had to change line spacing in something like Microsoft Word, before you, let's say, turned in a paper in high school or college, and it needed to be 1.5 or 2 point line spacing, we can do the exact same thing with CSS. So it's line height. Let's select the paragraph, line height, and then we just give it a number, and this will multiply the current line height, which is always determined by the font itself. If we have a larger font, we're going to have a larger space between lines. So let's refresh, and now we get double spacing. So we can, multiply that by 5. Usually you don't do much with line height aside from maybe 1.5 or 2. Okay, so that's line height. Go back to 2. Well, let's do 1.5. The next one is text align. So just like Microsoft Word or any word processor, text align controls how the text of a given element is actually aligned, if it's to the left, to the right, or to the center. So let's take our H1 to start, and let's center it. So if we inspect it, you'll see that the H1 takes up this entire length of the screen, but the text itself is only on the left side. So if we use text align, we can say text align right, and we'll move all the way to the right side. And if we do text align center, it will move to the center. So let's start. Select the H1, and let's do text align right. save, refresh, and you can see the H1 is now aligned to the right. And we can do the same thing to paragraphs, but let's text align center them. So text align center, save, refresh, and it's a small shift, but you can see that now our paragraphs are aligned center rather than left. So one last property is text decoration. And text decoration is used to give text an underline effect or a strike through, and also something called an overline, which is just underline except on top. So let's give all paragraphs a underline effect. So we just do text decoration underline, and we refresh, and we get a lot of underlined text. And we can do the same thing for our H1, and we'll do strike through. Line through. And there we go, we get this line through. Okay, so that's the basics of font and text-based properties in CSS. We're going to now, in the next video, actually talk about including custom fonts. In this video, we're going to talk about ways of including custom fonts and using them in our CSS, so that we don't have to rely on these built-in fonts, the system fonts like Arial and Georgia, that are not very reliable in the first place. Some people's machines won't have them, and they're pretty limited. Even if all of them are available, it's not many fonts, and it's not many good fonts. So luckily, it's pretty easy to include our own fonts, and that can be a font that we own, that we've purchased, that our company owns, although they can get very, very expensive if you've never looked into font pricing. Some of the better ones can cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. So Google has an option out there. It's called Google Fonts, and it's a really great resource. Basically, Google has a bunch of, I think it's about 100 fonts online for free that are very easy to include in our own application with just a few clicks. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So if we go to Google Fonts, it's just google.com/fonts. You'll see we're immediately presented with a list of fonts here. And we can scroll through them. We can sort them by popularity, alphabetical, most recent. We can change the preview text that we're looking at. Usually you just keep it how it is. And I'm actually going to just pick two fonts here that are very distinct. So don't judge me based off of which ones I pick. They may not be my favorite, but they're just going to be obvious so that you can see that they're different. So I'm going to go, let's do popularity, and let's pick Railway here. And I'm going to click this button, Add to Collection. And what that does, it sort of adds it to my shopping cart. And then the next one I'm going to pick, let's go for another very different one. Let's try this Indie Flower. Add to Collection. So the next thing I'm going to do is click on this Use tab. So what I've said is I want both of these fonts. Now I click on Use. And now I need to decide which font weights I want available. So different fonts have different weights that are available on Google Fonts. So you can see Railway has every single possible option between 100 and ultra bold at 900. One thing to pay attention to is you don't want to include more than you're going to use. And this little meter over here reminds you of the page load, or the effect on page load that including multiple weights will have. And that's because every single font and weight that you include is another request that needs to be made. It's more data that needs to be loaded. So what we want to do here is just minimize the number that we need. So I'm just going to use normal and bold for Railway, and then I don't have an option for Indie Flower. There's only one weight, which is normal. So now that I've selected those, I scroll down, and all I have to do is copy this link right here. So this is a link that I put in my HTML. I'm going to go to my HTML here and just paste it in and save. And you can look at the URL here, and you'll notice it's almost the same. Well, it's exactly the same type of tag. It's a link tag. The only difference between my style sheet and this style sheet is the href. So rather than styles.css, my custom local style sheet, it's on google.com or fonts.googleapis.com. And we have family equals Railway, weight 400 and 700, Indie Flower. So suppose I did want a bold, I could just easily go here and add 800. Okay, so that is all we have to do to get the font. It's so easy to do. The next step is to use it. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you what it looks like right now in case you forgot. Wonderful site. Let's start by changing this H1. So let's make the H1 use the Indie Flower font. So I'm just going to change it here. H1, I have font family as Georgia. I just change it to Indie Flower. And that's it. Very, very easy. Refresh and you can see it's now Indie Flower. Same thing to use Railway on paragraphs. I just change the font family to Railway. Save and refresh, and I now have this new font here. The other thing we can do is change our paragraph to use the other font weight. So we got 2, remember. Let's just go with normal. It looks a lot better. Doesn't look very good either way, but I prefer the lighter weight rather than the bold. So again, Google Fonts is a great resource. One thing though I'll mention is if you do have fonts that you own, all you have to do to link to them is use a link tag. So rather than linking to one of Google's fonts, you just link to your own font file. So you can read more on MDN about the specific font file types that are supported. But basically it works the same way, except rather than including a Google font, you can include your own custom font. Luckily though, Google Fonts has all sorts of great fonts. You can make awesome websites, and plenty of people use Google Fonts exclusively, even for professional websites. So one of the most important concepts that we have yet to cover in CSS is positioning of elements. So how do we lay out a page or move a div to the top right? Or how do we make an anchor tag wider or add spacing between images? All of that is really important, and it's all related to something called the box model. So the box model is this basic idea that's really central to everything in HTML and CSS, which is that basically every element has a rectangular box around it. So we can see here, I'm just going to go to any web page on MDN. I have the inspector open and I have the magnifying glass selected. And as I hover over every element, you can see that there's a box around it. So this H2 has a blue box around it. This H1 has a box. Even things that aren't particularly boxy, so this rounded corner div, it still has a box around it behind the scenes. So does this here. And this one is really not round or not boxy looking because it has these rounded corners, but it's still a box. So these boxes are really useful behind the scenes because we can style different properties on them. So there are 4 properties, or 4 different parts of every box. There's a lot more properties, but 4 parts of the box that we can manipulate. So let's suppose that this diagram, which is also from MDN, is of a paragraph. So I have some text in a paragraph and I give it a orange or a yellow border. And this is what the user sees. Some text and a border. But behind the scenes, there's actually some other things happening. So between the border and the text, there's something called padding. So padding is just the space on the inside of the border. So between the content and the border is padding. And then there's also margin, which is on the other side. It's between the border on the outside and anything else. So we use margin often to add spacing between elements. So if we had 2 paragraphs and I wanted them to be further apart, then I would use margin and increase that. So now we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into actually the syntax of some of the properties that we want to use. Before we do that, I want to just show you 2 things you can look forward to making. The first one, it's not the most exciting, but what is important is that we now have a way of making something that looks like this. Up until now, we don't actually have a way of making these boxes that are connected to one another, that have a width assigned to them, but they're empty, there's no text inside. So we're going to learn about the box model and apply that here to make this tic-tac-toe board. And then we're going to make this portfolio site for a fictional photographer. So this is nice, it's images, it's responsive, so it changes size as I change the window size, and this is a grid. All of this is based off of the concepts we're going to learn here. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Sublime here, and I have a really simple document that I've created. So it's just a simple HTML. It has a style sheet connected that's empty aside from a few comments, and then 2 paragraphs. So if I open this up, You can see that it's very basic, very boring, and we're just going to use this to play around with the box model. So I'm going to go to my CSS, and I'm going to select paragraphs. And then I'm just going to copy these comments inside so that I can write some code beneath them, just to visually tell you what I'm doing. So let's start by giving these a border. So this should be review, border, and let's do 2 pixels solid blue. Save that, refresh, and you can see that we get a border all the way around the content. And what you'll also notice is that the content here goes all the way across the screen. Our border doesn't stop right here. And that's because when we make a paragraph, by default, it goes all the way across the screen. So if I want to change the width of the paragraph itself, of the text, I can use the width property. And I'm going to go ahead and give a width of 100, let's do 200 pixels to start. And if I refresh, you can see we've now changed the width. If I inspect, the content is in blue. And then we have a border around it. So the content is blue, and on this diagram, that is this box right here, this element box. And then we have a border that is directly around it. There's no space between the border and the content. One other thing with the width, and also there's a height. So let's do a height of 300 pixels. You can see we've just added a bunch of space. I'm going to get rid of that. But there's a height that we can use just like width. We don't have to just use pixels. So we can use percentages. And those are really useful. So let me show you. Let's do 50%. And you might be wondering, what is it 50% of? And the answer is that it's 50% of the parent element. So in this case, it's the body that the paragraph is inside of. The paragraph goes halfway across the body. In our case, the body is the entire page, goes all the way across, so we end up with half the page. And what's nice about this, if I change the window size, that also changes. So a lot of people will use this, and we will use it actually. It's used in this image grid. You can see that the images change their width, and that's a percentage. Okay. So I'm going to keep it at like that for now. And then the next property we're going to talk about is padding. And remember, padding is this space between the element and the border. And right now we don't have any space. The border's right on top. So there's a property called padding, and we can give it a number of pixels. And let's do 10 pixels to start. Save the file, refresh, and now we have 10 pixels of padding on all sides. So if I inspect now, you'll see there's now this green content that's introduced. So we have the blue content itself, and then we have the green around it, which is between the border and the content. So we can obviously increment this, and we get a lot more space on the inside. But this is not the only way to set padding. This sets it on all 4 sides as exactly the same. But sometimes we only want padding on one side or 2 sides. Just like with border, there are shortcuts for the longer version where we would say border top, 10 pixels, border bottom, 5 pixels. Same thing with padding. I'm going to comment that out. And we can do something like padding left, 40 pixels. And we refresh, and we get padding right here, and that's the only place where padding is. And remember, the space over here, this blue, is not the padding. That's our actual content. That's from this width here. So different, even though it looks like there's space on the right, it's coming from a different place. So another thing that we can do here is play with the margin. So the margin is the last piece of the puzzle. It's the space on the outside of the border, so between elements. So this is going to be useful because we might want to increment or increase this space right here. Or as an example here, this space right here in between the images is set using margin. So it actually looks just like padding. So we can say margin, and let's do something obvious like 100 pixels to start, and refresh. And what happened is we now have 100 pixels of space on all sides of the element on the outside of the border. So if I inspect, you'll see that in Chrome, that's identified as orange. So blue is the content, green is the padding, and orange is the margin. So just like padding, sometimes we only want to set one part of the margin, one side. So we can do something like margin top is 500 pixels, and I'm going to comment this one out for now and save. And we only get space on the top. On the left, there's nothing. And then more space on the top of this one, nothing on the bottom or the left or the right. So that's margin. So sometimes we want to add values to all sides of the margin, but we don't want to have to do it with 4 different lines. So we don't want them to be exactly the same like they are here, but we don't want to have to say margin top, margin left, margin right, margin bottom. So there's another shortcut, just like for border, where we can do things at once. We can do this, margin, and give it 4 values. So the first one is for the top, and then the right, and then the bottom. Let's do 500 pixels, and then the left. And by doing that, we get this nice 4-sided margin where the values are all different, but we only had to do it in one line. So just to inspect this here, you can see we get the 500 pixels on the bottom, we get the 20 on top, we get the 100 on the left, and then we have our 40 on the right. So there's one last thing that you'll see often with margin, which is margin auto. So what we can do is set the margin to be auto on the left or the right, and what that will do is actually center an element for us. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to comment this out again, and we can write margin, and let's just say 0 margin on top, auto on the left, or on the right, 0 margin on bottom, and auto on the left. And if I make this full size and refresh, you'll see that it centers things for us. So what that means, it's decided that this is 50% because we set that here. And then it figures out the left is auto and the right is auto. So it just does as much as it needs to do, and that will actually center it for us. And then we have 0 on the top and the bottom, so they're scrunched together. What we can also do, there's an even shorter way of doing this, and it looks like this: margin, 0, auto. And so this will set the top and bottom to 0, the left and right to auto. So nothing changes. And we can also use this syntax if I want to add 50 pixels to the top and auto, or I want to add 50 pixels and 20 pixels. The one thing to remember is you need the px there unless the number is 0. So if I do this, it adds 20 on the top, on the left and the right, and then it adds 50 on the top and bottom. So let's recap here just one more time. We've got the inner content, which is right here. We've got padding, which is between the border, so all we have is padding left. And then we have margin, which is between the border and on the other side, so between elements basically. So in the next few videos, we are going to apply these concepts and use them throughout this course. Okay, so it's time for yet another exercise here. And in this video, we're going to work on creating a tic-tac-toe board, as you can see over here on the left. And this board obviously doesn't do anything. We can't do any logic there and actually complete the game until we get to the JavaScript unit. So the first thing that we need to do is talk about how this is actually structured. So I'm going to let you try and do this on your own, but the first thing that I want to show is that this is a table here. So this is a table with 3 rows. And then in each row, there are 3 TDs. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then what we've done is given them a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. And then we've selectively turned on the border. So for these middle elements, there's a left and a right border. Left, right, left, right. And then for the middle horizontal elements, there's a top and bottom border. Top and bottom, top and bottom. So I want to let you try and do that on your own first, and then in the next video, we'll do a solution as we go over it together. Okay, so in this video, we're going to recreate this tic-tac-toe board exercise from scratch. So we're going to start from the very beginning with an empty file. I called mine board.html. Going to add in our boilerplate. Just going to call it TTT board. And the way that this works, just to jog your memory, it's a table. This whole thing is a table. It has 3 rows, 1, 2, and 3. and then each row has 3 TDs. So we end up with a 3x3 board. And then what we'll do is go in, and on these 3 TDs, we're going to turn the left and right border on. And then on these 3, we're going to turn the top and bottom border on. So we need to start with our table, and then 3 TRs. And I'm actually going to go and do 3 TRs and do the TDs first. So we get 3 TDs, and then I'm just going to duplicate that. Once more. Now we have our 3 rows with 3 elements or 3 TDs in each one. So we'll save that. And if we open this in the browser, you'll notice that we don't see a thing. And that's because even though our table is there, first of all, there's nothing in our table. And then also we don't have any styles applied, because it is possible to have an empty table and still see things, which is actually what this is here. There's no data in these tables. In this example here, it's just a table, and then it's styled so that it has a width and it has a border. So we need to do that. So just to prove to you though that it's here, let's add some style. And I'm gonna do it in a style tag this time, which you should know by now is not a great idea in the long run. But just for a solution video, just for the ease of watching here so you don't have to watch me flip between files and get confused about what goes where, I'm just gonna do it in one file here at the top in a style tag. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just select the TDs and give them a width. And that's because right now, if we inspected the TDs, you would see that they are basically not there at all. They're 2 pixels by 2 pixels, so they're really, really small. And that's because there's nothing there and we haven't assigned them a width or a height. So what I want to do is give them a width, and we're going to start with 100 pixels, and then we're going to do the same thing for height. And we save and refresh, and we still don't see anything. And again, that's because we haven't given them anything to display. But if we go and inspect now, we can see each TD is now a square 100 by 100 pixels. So let's go and give them a background just so you can see that they're there. Let's say background is pink, save, and now we can see we have the beginnings of our board. So I'm actually going to undo that background color. I just wanted to show you that the tiles are there. We have our TDs. And now what we need to do is figure out how to selectively turn on the border. So we're going to start on these 3 elements. We want to turn on the left and the right border. So if I refresh the page, so let's start by taking this top one right here and giving it a left and a right border. So I'm going to go, and that's the second TD instead of the first TR. I'm just going to give it a class, and I'm just going to call this one vertical. And I'm going to make a class for these 3 called vertical, where we just give the left and right borders. So class equals vertical, and then over here, we're going to select vertical and just give it a border left. Whoops. And let's do 1 pixel black for now. And do the same thing for border right. And if we save and we refresh, you'll see we have the first square completed. So now we need to add the TD that's below it and the TD that's below that. And that's why I made it a class, because we're going to use it more than once. So rather than making this an ID and then doing another ID for this element and another ID for this one, which I totally could have done. I could have done something like ID middle, and then this one would be ID middle bottom or something. Well, I couldn't have a space there, but something like that. That's actually not a great idea. We don't want to have multiple IDs, so I'm just going to give it a class, and then our class is vertical. So I'm going to give it to this one as well. This is our middle element that's right below it, and then the other one, which is below that. So those 3 now have class vertical, and you can see we get our 3 vertical lines. So now we just need to repeat the same process on the horizontal lines. And so we want this element here, this one here, and this one here to have a border top and a border bottom. So this time I'm going to start with the class, and I'm going to call it horizontal. And I'm just going to copy this, except change border left to border top and border bottom. And then all we need to do is assign this horizontal class to the correct elements. So the ones that we want that to be on are this one right here. So this is going to be the first TD in the second TR. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Class equals horizontal. I'm going to copy that. Then we want it in this middle one here. And you'll see we already have a class vertical. And we haven't actually seen this before where we have more than one class. It's really easy. All we do is add a space. So this is not one class called vertical horizontal. It is two, vertical and also horizontal. And then we'll do the same thing to this last TD, which would be this one here. And if we save and we refresh the page, we now have our completed tic-tac-toe board. So the very last thing that I want to do here is just move this over so that it's centered. And that's actually really easy. It's just one line of CSS on our table. We're going to give it a margin of auto. And there we go. That margin is automatically computed. You can see as I as I resize the window, that margin is increasing and decreasing. And then one last thing, if we wanted to add that H1 in at the very top, that just says tic-tac-toe, you can do that. But you'll notice that this element, if I inspect it, well, you can see without even inspecting it that it's all the way over on the side. So if I want it to go in the middle, the element actually takes up all the way across the screen. You can see this blue here. So I can just center the text, and that will give us the effect that the H1 is actually in the middle. So I just go select H1, text align, center, and I save, and there we go. We've got a tic-tac-toe board. In this video, we're going to create this photographer's portfolio site from scratch. And usually I would ask you to attempt to do this on your own and then give you a solution video following this. However, this time it's a deliberate code along, so I'd like you to attempt to code along. And if you prefer, you can watch it once through and then code along the next time. But the goal here is that we're going to do it together. And there are two other things that we want to get out of this. The first one is there's a new property I'm going to show called float. And the second thing is I just want you to get a little experience building something that you can be somewhat proud of that looks a little bit better than some of the simple things that are just really bright, awful colors that we've done so far. So this is a really minimal photo blog that we're going to do. So let's get started. Open up Sublime. I have a single file called photogrid.html. I'm going to first show you the image URLs that we're working with. So these are images, 9 images, 3 images each from 3 different photographers that I found on Flickr. All the photos are licensed under Creative Commons. You can view the license here. So before we do anything with these image URLs, I'm actually going to get rid of them. And I'm going to add in my HTML skeleton, add in photo blog, and I'm going to do a quick demonstration. So you don't have to code along with this part. I'm going to add 2 divs, one that says hello and one that says goodbye. And I'm going to save them. And then I'm going to add my style sheet in, which I'm calling photos.css. And then over here, I'm going to style my divs. So I'm actually going to give them an ID. Just call it 1. And again, this is just to demonstrate something. And then 2. Then over here, I'm going to select 1 and 2. And all I'm going to do is just give them a different background color. Red, and then background color purple. And then I'm going to give both of them, all divs, a width of 100 pixels. So when I do this and I open it up in the browser, we have 2 divs, one after another. Remember that if we inspect, they are basically set up so that they take their own line. their block level element. So if I don't want that to happen, which is what we're going to do for the image grid, we want our images to form a grid where multiple are on the same line. And if I want to do that with divs, I need to use a property called float, or that's one way that I can accomplish it. So here, all I do is say float left. And what that will do, it will take the elements, all divs, out of the normal flow of the document. So they're stacked currently on separate lines. And what will happen is that they will float to the left. So think of it as gravity going away almost in our document. And so this div is going to float up and push to the left against this one. So if I refresh here, you can see that they're now on the same line. So we're going to use this principle when we're using images so that we can get images to basically go up against one another and form a grid. So I'm going to get rid of all of this now and get rid of the divs that we have. And I'm going to add in our image links. So I'm going to make this full screen and just paste in these image links that are in that file included with this video. And rather than making 9 image tags like this, where I make an image tag and then copy a URL and then paste it in 9 times, which would be very slow, I'm going to use a little bit of sublime magic here, where I'm using command click to select the beginning of every line, and then I'm just going to type image source equals and then move to the end of the line. So I used command right arrow. Command left arrow takes you to the beginning, command right goes to the end, and then I'm going to finish with quote and then the closing bracket. So that was a really easy and quick way to enclose all those URLs as image tags. So if I save this and I go to the browser, you'll see when I refresh, we now have 9 images. Of course, they're not in a grid, they're taking up a lot of space. So what we're going to do now is go to our style sheet and select all images. And the first thing that we probably want to do here is just give them a width. So let's give them a width like 100 pixels to start. And this is going to be way too small, but I want you to see what happens. I refresh, and you'll notice that all of these images now are in a line together, but that there's some spacing between them that we didn't specify. We never set margin or padding or anything. So what's happening is that there's actually some white space that's being added, and it's a little bit of a quirky thing in HTML, but when we have images without anything else, there's a white space or just a single space that's added between these. So if we want to get rid of that, we can use float. And remember that float will take things out of the flow of the document. So if I refresh now, you can see that our images are butting up against one another, and there's basically no space at all between them. And then we can go back and add that space in ourselves. So we obviously don't want them to take up this little space. We do want 3 going across, and we want some margin between them, but we want to control that. So by floating them, we got rid of the white space that the browser added for us, so that we can now go and add our own custom spacing using the margin property rather than actual white space. So now we're going to change the width, and let's start with 30%. So remember that the percent is relative to the parent element, so the body. So each one will take up 30% of the body. And the reason I'm starting with 30 is just to make sure they all fit on one line, or that 3 fit in one line. And you'll see that we get 3 of them going across, no space between, and then we have our 10% over here, because this is only 90% that we're taking up. So we're going to use that other percentage to actually split up the margin and add some spacing between them. So already we have a 3x3 grid, but what we want to do next is make it look like this, where we have even spacing between them. So we actually have to do a little bit of math. So I've already done it, but basically if we calculate this, there's a margin here, 1, there's a margin here, 2, there's a margin here, 3, and then on this one, 4, then on this one, 5, and on this one, 6. So we have 10%, and we need to divide that by 6. And 10 divided by 6 is 1.66. So what we're going to do is just say margin 1.66%. So if we go back to the browser and check out the result and refresh, you'll see that we get 3 evenly spaced images with spacing between them. So the math, just to hit that one more time, each one of these is 10%, so that gives us 30%. And each one has a margin of 1.6% on either side. So we take both sides, left and right, 1.6 times 2 plus 30%, and we get 33.3% per each one of these. So that's 1/3 exactly, or almost exactly. We are rounding, but that's the best we can do here. So 33.3% each one of these. We can inspect just to verify that. There we go. You can see they take up exactly 1/3. So the next thing that we want to do is add in the text at the top. So it needs to look like this. And fortunately, this is relatively simple compared to making this image grid. So the first thing we need to do is get the font. This font is called Railway. It's one of the Google fonts that we've seen so far. So I'm going to go to Google Fonts and look for Railway. Here we go. It's the top one here. Use. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab normal, and also let's do 800. And then we'll include this into our HTML. So we now have access to that font. And then all we need to do is add in the text first of all. So up top, I'm just going to make it a paragraph. And I'm just going to put my name, which is what I had here, separated by a slash. We can put whatever you want here. This could be text, this could be photography blog, or welcome to my blog, but just some text. I'm keeping it simple. And then save that. And then we'll go over here, select paragraph, and then we'll just say font family, Railway. And let's just see what we end up with. Okay, so not the most exciting, not quite there yet. It's too small, and it's not spaced correctly. We need it to move over 1.6% as well, just like this image. So to move it in line, we can start there. All we need to do is go over to our paragraph and add in our margin left. And that's just 1.66%. We refresh. Okay, now it's spaced correctly. So one more thing that we want to do is definitely increase the font size. So I know that the font size that I used here is 23 pixels. And not only that, but I used font weight of 800, which is why I had to select that. So in here, we'll say font size 23 pixels. I'll show you what that looks like. So it's bigger, but it's still not as bold. So then we go back and add in font weight 800 and save. Now we refresh and the font is looking close, but we're still missing one thing, which is the fact that I didn't use uppercase text. So I can do that using text transform, or I could alter the HTML. So I'm just going to do that here, text transform uppercase. Now we get all uppercase. There we go. So you can see just with that quick example why you would potentially use text transform, because it's much faster and easier just to add one CSS property rather than having to retype every single letter yourself, especially if you have a longer string of characters. Okay, so now the last missing piece is this little line here. I know it's pretty faint, but there's a line right here, and it goes in line with this first image. So it doesn't go all the way across. It goes 30% of the way across. So the way that we're going to do that is it's actually just a border on the bottom of, let's inspect it, on the bottom of this paragraph. So you can see that the paragraph itself goes 30% of the way across. It ends here, and then it's just border bottom that we turned on. So let's go back to our CSS, and under our paragraph, let's start by giving it border bottom, and let's make it obvious to start. So let's do like 3 pixels solid red. So we'll save, and refresh. And you'll see that the border goes all the way across. And I guess it doesn't look too bad. We definitely want to fix this here. But rather than do that, I'm going to change the width so that it only goes 30% of the way across. So we'll start with that. So that's just a matter of assigning the width to the paragraph, 30%. Okay, so now it ends there. Then the next thing is making the color match. So the color that I use is very, very faint. Just going to change this here. It's a hexadecimal color, F1, F1, F1. Looks like that. You can see it's very faint. And I think I had it at 2 pixels rather than 3. So very minor change. Change that to be 2 pixels. And the very last thing is the spacing. So here you can see we have some space between the text and the border, and here we don't. So remember, space between an element and its border is padding. So if we inspect, we can verify that. You can see that green padding there. So we just need to get padding going here as well. So in our CSS, we're just going to do padding bottom, 20 pixels. And we'll go back, refresh, and now we have a little bit of space there. Now, of course, feel free to play with this however you like. If you preferred that line going all the way across or no line at all, if you want to make this text bigger, if you wanted to make get rid of the padding or add more padding, if you want more images going across the screen rather than just 3, there's all sorts of things you can do. All right, so I hope you enjoyed making something that looks somewhat okay. All right, so it's time for another exercise. And as you can see here, we're going to build a simple minimalist blog site. And this exercise is really going to focus on pretty much everything we've covered, but it's really going to hit on a lot of the box model things. So padding and margin and borders, as well as typography, getting a new Google font, and a few other things. So we're going to build this. I'm going to give you a few instructions if you do want to attempt it on your own first. And then we're going to go over it, as always, starting from scratch in the next video. So I'll give you some hints. The first thing you'll probably notice is this gray box. And that's actually a border that's around the body. So the body has this 20 pixel border that goes all the way around it. And so that means that the body has an explicit width, that it's not going all the way across the screen, but it goes from here to there. So another thing that I'll mention here are some of the colors. So you don't have to guess the colors. It would be a good exercise for you to actually use a color picker and try and find these out on your own. But because I'm not sure how the quality will be carried over through video and if that will change some things, I'm just going to give you the colors. So I have them typed up here. You can refer back to these, or you can feel free to use your own colors. But the border color around the body here is this shade of gray. The date color, this blue, is this shade of blue here. And then the heading color for the blog titles is this shade of bluish gray. And then one other thing is that you'll need to have a font included here. And this font, I definitely would not expect you just to guess off the top of your head. It's called Source Sans Pro, and it's available on Google Fonts. So you'll have to go on Google Fonts, download it, and include it. Well, you don't have to download it, but include it correctly in your HTML or your CSS file. So a few other things. This block quote right here, this effect is just a left border that's been turned on. So it's the same gray color as we have here, it's just thinner. So that's a left border. One thing you'll need to pay attention to is making sure these are all aligned exactly the same. Notice there's a little margin or padding or something here. The next thing that I'll point out here is that the date is in all caps. So there's a way to do that with your CSS, make it uppercase. And also that there's a little bit of letter spacing here. So this is not the normal letter spacing, they're spaced a little further apart. And then one last thing, in between the posts, there's this line. And this is an HR element, it stands for horizontal rule. And so you can add an HR in, and as far as styling this to get this thin line that kind of shrinks down, I found something online. I'm just going to show it to you in the next video, but just research HR styles, and there are so many great articles and code pens that you can just copy one of. So I don't expect you to get this just right. Other than that, feel free to use any text that you want. I think this is bacon ipsum, but put any text you want. Feel free to have more than 2 posts, and then also go crazy with colors and fonts and make it your own. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video. We'll start from scratch. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this blog from scratch. So feel free to follow along here. I'm going to go from creating a new file all the way up to finishing this blog here. So the first thing that we'll want to do, I'm going to keep the solution open just so that I can reference it and make sure we have colors correct and font sizes. But the first thing that we really want to do is get our files set up. So I have 2 files, a blog.html, and it has nothing in it so far except the title, blog, and it's linked to a style sheet called blog.css that's empty. So this is just the 2 files that we're going to need. And now let's go ahead and fill them in. So we have to decide when we're doing something like this, where do we start? And I think the best solution is to start with some of this markup in our HTML and styling some of it. But we don't have to get everything there perfect word for word before we actually style things. So I would start by maybe putting a paragraph or 2 and one of these headers in our body. And to do that, this is lorem ipsum text, except it's bacon ipsum, which is just at baconipsum.com. Click on Give Me Bacon and just copy one of the paragraphs. I'm just going to use what I have here, but the words aren't so important as long as there are words there. So if you want to use bacon ipsum, go ahead. But if you if you object to bacon, you can pick any other ipsum or just make up your own words or actually put your own blog post there. That would be ideal. And then I'm going to also just put one of the headings here. And one note, it might make sense to make these in H1, both of them, but generally the rule is you want to have one H1 on the page. It should be the biggest thing on your page. So because we have multiple multiple headings here, multiple article titles, I'm going to go with H2, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter at all because we're going to style everything about it. We're going to change the font size, we're going to change the color, and all of the things that would be set by making it an H1 versus an H2, those differences will be eliminated anyways. So I'm going to go with H2, and I'm just going to say this is my first article. Not the most creative title. Let's save it, and let's just preview it to start. So open it up. Okay, so there's our blog so far. So we have a bunch of decisions to make. The first place that I might start is in getting this body to have this border. So I did provide the colors in the last video. I'm just going to copy this color here, and I'm going to give the body a border. So we'll select the body, and then all we have to do is say border, and it's 20 pixels solid, this gray color. And let's check that out. Okay, so it doesn't quite look the way that we would want it to look, but it's getting there. We have the border. Let's make it full size so we can really compare. So another thing that you'll notice is that our border, there's one problem, which is it goes all the way, the whole body takes up the entire page, versus here, the body only takes up part of the page, and then there's spacing on either side. Then there's also this spacing on the inside that we don't have because our words in our text go right up against the border. So let's start by solving that problem. And to fix that, of course, we need padding. So this is 20 pixels padding on all sides. You can see there's padding at the bottom and the left and the right as well. So in the body, we're just going to assign padding 20 pixels on all 4 sides, and we get this. Okay, so that's a little bit closer. The next thing that we should work on is getting the width correct. And it's not just a matter of getting the width to be the right size when it's full screen, but also as it shrinks down. You'll see that it stays, this is 700 pixels, it stays at 700 pixels for a while, and then it shrinks and scales. So we want to make sure we can get that to happen. So we're going to use a little bit of a trick. And then the one other thing we want to do is make sure that it's centered. Right now, well, we can't really tell, but it's not centered. It's going to be on the left side. So let's go ahead and add the width in first. So let's say width 700 pixels and save. And this is what I was talking about. it's on the left, and we want to center it in the middle. And to do that, we can use the margin auto trick that I talked about in the box model video. So we're going to set a margin, and we're going to just use the shortcut. So we're going to do 0 pixels up top and bottom, and then auto on the left and right. Remember, when we just do 2 here rather than 4, this is top and bottom, and this is left and right. So that centers it for us automatically. But then you'll notice by giving it a 0 top and bottom, it's now right up against the top. And this one here is not. We have some space. There's 20 pixels right there. So that's a simple fix, just the same line. Change that back to 20 px. We do need the px. We didn't before, because when it's 0, you can just leave it as 0. But when there's a number, we need the px. Okay, so that's looking pretty close. The only thing is that as we shrink, we want this to stay 700 pixels until it can no longer stay 700 pixels, and we want it to shrink down. And it's pretty easy to do that, actually. All that we want to do is change this to be max width, and then we're going to assign it a percentage width. And what this says is make it 80% when you need to, but at a maximum, make it 700 pixels. So I'll show you what that looks like. When we refresh, nothing changes because it's at its maximum 700 pixels. So it checks if 80% would be more than 700 pixels, which it would in this case. So it stays at 700, still stays at 700, until right here where it starts to shrink. That's where 80% now is less than 700 pixels. Okay, so now we have our basic body set up. The next thing that I'd like to do here is get our font going. So again, if we go to the notes that I have from the last video, the font is called Source Sans Pro. So let's go ahead and head over to Google Fonts and look for Source Sans Pro. So I have it open here, but again, it's just google.com/fonts. And let's do a search for Source Sans Pro. It's right here. Add to collection. Use. And now we have a choice. Which font weights do we want? And I actually didn't tell you this in the original video, but this is just the normal font face, or the font weight, 400, and this is a heavier weight, it's bolded. So we're gonna want both of those. So normal and bold, 400 and 700, and that's it. We go down here and copy this link. We can get rid of Google Fonts now. And we're gonna go to our HTML and just paste that link in. And now we have the ability to use Source Sans Pro. So let's assign it to both paragraphs and H2s. And we also want it to be on these dates. So what we could do is select paragraph and say font family, Source Sans Pro. And we could do the same thing for H1s. But that's not a really good use of our CSS. Our code is going to be a little bit repetitive. Every element that we want to use it on, we would have to go and add this in. So what we do instead is just apply it to the body. And by applying it to the body, everything inside of it will inherit it. So font family, Source Sans Pro, and save, refresh, and there we go. We have our H1 using it, or our H2, and we have our paragraph. So that's looking pretty good so far. So the next thing we might want to focus on is thinking about our HTML a little bit more. So what I'm going to want to do here is go ahead and add the date in, add this paragraph here, this quote paragraph, and then we might also want to group our elements or our posts together so that we have one post as an element. And to do that, I'm just going to use a div here. So I'm going to make a new div, class equals post. So I'm just giving it a class just to make it clear what this is, because just by saying div, it's not very clear what it's doing. And this will be one post. And then we'll have another div class post for this second one down here. So let's go ahead and add in a date as well. And for that date, that could really be anything. I'm going to make it another div, class equals date, but that could be a paragraph as well if we wanted it to be. It doesn't really matter in this case. And then another thing we want to do is add in this quote. And I'm just going to make that a paragraph down here. But I'm going to make it slightly different, of course, because I need to style it differently than these paragraphs. So I'm going to say, let's go give it a class called quote. And then while we're here, let's add in our date here, November 23rd, 2015, and save. So if we refresh right now, it's not going to look really close to what we're looking for. We have to change the date quite a bit. We need to change the font size of this H1. Here, let me make them side by side. We need to add in this left border here on the quote. We need to change the color of this, the spacing of this, and then we need to add this HR in. So let's go ahead and start by styling this left border here. So remember, we have the class which we called quote right here. We're going to want to go back to our CSS and select dot quote. And then all we need to do is add in border left 5 pixels, and the color is the same as this one. So 5 pixels, solid gray, that shade of gray. And let's save it. And we take a look. Okay, so that's looking close. The only thing you'll notice is that there's some spacing here. And of course, that spacing is between the border, the left border, and the element. So that would be padding that we need to change. So to change the padding, I'm just going to do padding left 5 pixels. And let's refresh. And that looks pretty good. You can see these look identical now, the two quote paragraphs. So next up, we have a few choices. Let's go ahead and tackle the date. So there's a few things. We want to make it all uppercase. We want to change the color. And we want to add this line spacing, or the letter spacing. So I'm going to move this over to the left. Select the date class. That's what we called it. Div class date. So dot date. And while I'm here, let's grab the color, which is this particular shade of blue, and let's just assign color to be that blue and refresh. You can see we're part of the way there. So to make it all uppercase using CSS, you might remember from the selector video, text transform uppercase. And if we refresh, okay, that's looking pretty close. Pretty much the only thing we have left to do is the letter spacing. So we have a bunch of options for letter spacing as far as the size and the units we use, but the property is called letter spacing. And then we can give it a number. So I'm just going to do 10 pixels first to show you. And that gives us 10 pixels between numbers, which is quite a bit and much more than we need. So what I'm actually going to use is another unit called REM. And REM is just like EMs, which are relative to the element that they're nested inside of, except that REMs are not set by the parent element. They're actually set by the root element on the page. So what that means is if I access inside the body 2.0 REM and I set font size to be 2.0 REM and I do that inside of quote as well, they're actually referring to the same font size. Versus if this was EM, it would be setting the body to be twice as big as the parent element, and then the quote, which is inside the body, would be twice as big as this one here. So it's relative. When we add in REM, though, it's referring to the root element. So this is a nice way to basically do proportional fonts without having to worry about what's nested inside of what. So I'm not going to change the font size on the body, but for our date, what we want to do, I'm going to use 0.2 REM. So that's just going to take the normal font size and add a little bit extra spacing between the letters, 0.2 of the font size. So you'll see here, we end up with that, which looks just right. It's 0.2. And I'm not expecting you just to know that. I know that it was 0.2 because I wrote it, but if I was doing this from scratch, I would have played around a little bit. And I would have tried 0.5 first, see what that looks like. Okay, that's too big. And it's not an exact science. It just is in this case because I was the one who wrote it. Okay, so we have that done. That looks pretty good. Let's compare these now. Really, all that we're missing, it looks like, aside from the extra content down here, is making this H2 bigger and slightly changing the color. So let's do the color first. We're going to select all H2s, and the color I have right here, just a dark blue. I'm going to set the color. If we refresh, it's really hard to see, but it changed ever so slightly. And then there are two other things. Well, there's one main thing that we'll want to do, which is changing the font size. And I happen to know that this is twice the font size as everything else. So that would be 2.0 REMs. So we just are going to set font size 2.0 REM, save, refresh, and we end up with this. So let's compare them now. And everything looks exactly the same up until this paragraph, which we're missing here, then everything below. So let's go ahead and add in this paragraph. I'm just going to copy the text, but feel free to use whatever text or lorem ipsum that you'd like. And then we'll add in another blog post and see how that looks. So back to the HTML, and I'm just going to add another paragraph at the bottom and paste that in. Okay, so that is our first blog post. If we compare them, they look identical, except for this HR. So that is one thing that we're going to want to add in there, is this HR, which we'll leave until the end. So next up, let's go ahead and just duplicate this markup, which is all I did here. I did use slightly different words, slightly different Bacum Ipsum between these paragraphs. So I'll just copy these two over into the HTML, but again, that's not the focus here. So what we want, again, make sure, let's just type this from scratch. So it's div class equals post. And some of you might be wondering why I even bothered putting a div with class equals post around everything. This would work fine without that. It's really just about grouping things together. Rather than having one giant mess where one blog post bleeds into another, I like to have things contained a little bit so that I know this is one post and it ends right here. So it's more just about, in my opinion, keeping the code a little bit clean. So then we wanted to have a div called date, or class equals date, and that date is December 11, 2015. Save that. Then we had an H2, and that H2, this is another article, which is another terrible article. Don't recommend that you read it. It's just about bacon. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this quote again, which is a paragraph, class equals quote, paste that in, and then we have two more paragraphs here, one, and finally the last bit of markup that we need, the second paragraph. There we go. So let's see how this looks. So one thing I'm noticing is that we have a little less spacing between the posts here. So this one just runs into this the date, December 11th. We definitely want a little spacing there, as we can see on the left. So part of that could be because of the HR that we're missing, although I think what we'll need to do is just add in some margin between the blog posts. So let's start by getting this HR in. So we haven't actually seen the HR element really in practice. It's a very simple one to use. Just looks like this. It's actually self-closing. Doesn't take anything. It's just, or it doesn't have any closing tag or any inner content. Just HR, horizontal rule. And if we refresh, what you'll see is that it gives us this line going across. And that ordinarily is fine. And most people, though, like to style these a little bit. So this one is really faint. I don't know if you can tell, but it's basically getting a little thicker and then trailing off on the edges. And there are some great resources and things online that you can use to style an HR. And the reason I added this in here is that I wanted to force you to look something up and to try to find some styles that you didn't write yourself. So I'm going to show you exactly what I would do to find some HR styles. I would just Google HR style and see what we get. And you can see I've actually clicked on 2 of them before. So we've got simple styles for HRs. And you can see there's a few options here. So I think this is the one that I went with right here. But let's just try one like this. Click on code. And all we have to do is copy these. These are 2 styles. And copy this down. And I don't want you to think that you need to understand every line here, because this is some stuff that is pretty advanced and kind of hacky. As you can see, this person says not really supposed to work, but does. The only thing that we want to do is make sure that these are going to be selecting our HR. And so what this is doing is selecting an HR with class of style 7, which we don't have. So let's just select HR. And let's just see what this looks like. Refresh the page. Okay, so there we go. So I personally don't care for that one. I'm going to use this one here that kind of trails off. Feel free to do whatever you'd like and play around with it. But again, the point was that I wanted you to try and find something external that you didn't write. And I want to show you that it's totally fine to do that. So I'm just copying this in. I didn't write this. I'm going to get rid of these styles here and put this in. So all they're doing is it looks like they're setting a border on the HR, so no border, height, which is just 1 pixel, and then this background image, which is a gradient. And so that's how they get that gradient effect. So if we refresh now, there you go. We have this nice gradient effect here. And if we wanted to, I actually prefer this one, so I'm just going to go ahead and keep this one over this. I might change the color a little bit so that it's a lighter gray, but let's just keep that for now. But we still have this problem, which is our next blog post is starting too soon, and we need to add some space there. So all that we need to do is add a little bit of a margin. So this is actually a nice coincidence that we have this blog post wrapper around every post, because we can just add a margin to the bottom of each post. So that will add space here. So all we need to do is select, let me just show you the class post. That's 1 post. So then we're just going here, select dot post, margin, and let's do 20 pixels. And not just margin, let's just do it on the bottom. So only margin bottom, refresh, and that's looking pretty close. So the last little issue here is that we have a little bit more space over here than we do here, and that's because this HR that we added is actually outside of the post class. So it's not being affected by that margin that we added in. So if we did that, we just move the HR, where is that? Here we go, to the bottom of the post, and we refresh. You can see we get the spacing that we wanted. Okay, so if we wanted to experiment and get this exact one, we would just go back to that HR styles and try some of the other ones. But what I really want to show again is that we can incorporate other styles in, and we don't really have to know exactly how they work, although it's a good idea to be curious and to try and figure it out. So hopefully you enjoyed making this project. It's a nice, simple, minimal blog. And for now, obviously it doesn't actually function as a blog. There are no comments. We can't add in a new post with any sort of interface. We have to actually edit the HTML ourselves. But when we get to JavaScript, and in particular when we get to the back end, and we have a database, and we have a server going, and a framework called Express, we're actually going to take this blog and turn it into a real blog where we can add a post using a form, we can comment, and we can do some other things like vote. So that's going to be really exciting. We'll use this CSS. It's relatively nice looking for relatively few lines. Okay, I'll see you when we cover JavaScript.